Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or whatever time of day you are watching this class. Good day. How are you guys doing? I wanted to let you know I'm filming with a little different. I'm going back to using my computer to film again. I had been using the school camera because it made a lot clearer, better image. So if you notice with my computer, when I wave my hands, it like goes all fuzzy, which is kind of cool, but not very good quality. Anyway, the school camera was a lot better, so I was using that. The only problem was that the batteries would run dead so quickly when I was doing a long video, and sometimes it would run dead in the middle of my lecture. So I realized I'd just done a lecture and I only got about half of it, so I had to go finish and all that. And I was getting sick of it. So I'm going back to the computer again. So image is not quite as good, quality is not quite as good, but anyway, we will make the most of it. Okay, so today we are on lesson 39. So you thought the last war was bad. We're in the 20th century. Remember how in the 1800s we were learning about how people were so positive and upbeat. Science was advancing, medicine was advancing. After the Civil War, there were no major conflicts. I mean, you had the Spanish-American War, I guess. But in Europe, there was no major conflicts at all in the 19th century. And people were pretty positive and pretty happy and thought, we're moving into a new era. And we've learned not to fight these terrible wars anymore. We've learned that it doesn't make sense to have wars. Until what? World War I, right? And World War I was the Great War that was supposed to end all wars. Did it? Absolutely not. About 20 years approximately later, you have another Great War. And so instead of just calling the Great War, now it's called World War I because we had World War II. And everybody's always worried about when we're going to have World War III. Hopefully that never happens, but anyway, we'll see. So you thought the last war was bad. Before we get into that, let's do a little bit of review. The Great Depression ended when? So make sure you're in your notes again, following along and helping answer these questions. The Great Depression ended when? In 1939. And what ended the Great Depression? World War II. Very good. So the Great Depression lasted for about 10 years, yes. What was the thing that came along that kind of added insult to injury, especially for people who were living in the Midwest? The farmers, they were working so hard to have good farms, and then this event came along that made life very miserable and difficult for them. It's called the Dust Bowl. Okay, it was a result of about 5 years of famine, and then windstorms that picked up topsoil and just covered miles and miles and miles of acreage with huge amounts of dust. Okay? When did the stock market crash that led to the Great Depression? October of 1929. And there were 3 days called Black Thursday, Black Monday, and Black Tuesday. Okay? What caused the Great Depression? Some of the factors: reckless investments, excessive borrowing, and overproduction in factories. Very good. The 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties, right? What were some of the characteristics of the 1920s? Let's see here. Yeah, what were some of the characteristics? What was their economy like during the 1920s? It was very strong. Yes, there were more consumer goods, more things for people to buy and use. Again, and we don't have it written down, but this is like vacuum cleaners, automobiles, radios, electric shavers, refrigerators, so things like that. What kind of entertainment became popular in the 1920s? entertainment through radio, with things like music was being played on the radio. Well, radios became more popular, and people could listen to music. Jazz music became popular. You could listen to the news. You could listen to political speeches, presidential speeches. Also, what else? Movies became popular. The movie industry moved from the east to the west and parked in Hollywood. That's where it is to this day. What kind of sports were popular in the 1920s? Baseball. Caleb. America's pastime. Football. Boxing. Tennis. Golf. There you go. You guys ever play golf? I used to play golf. I haven't done it for a long time. It's just way too frustrating. It's just not worth the money, right? So frustrating. Okay? It's fun hitting a ball as hard as you can, but when it goes completely in the wrong direction, it's just not fun anymore when you're trying to compete. Anyway, let's see. What it was another thing that came in to the 1920s, a popular movement was called modernism. What was modernism? It's when they emphasized science over the Bible. Evolution became a big deal. This led to religious liberalism, which was when certain churches were compromising very basic doctrine. Things like the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is like what Christianity is, right? Yeah. And then what were some of the ways that people reacted against norms? You had women dressing and acting a certain way. They wear short skirts, they smoked, or they drank beer, partied. What were they called? Flappers. And the 1920s was marked by a lot of pleasure seeking. Okay. So let's jump into our lesson today. So World War II. What were the contributing factors to World War II? What started World War II? So let's back up a little bit. In World War I, we talked about how it ended, right? The countries that won the war, particularly France, Great Britain to a certain degree, and some of the other countries that were involved in winning the war, were so angry about this war. They blamed who? Germany, right? So they just socked it to Germany. They forced them to agree to extremely harsh terms. Germany had to pay the expenses of the war. They were forced to not build up their military again, not their air force. I'm not sure. Maybe they could their military to a certain degree. They were absolutely forbidden to have any kind of, aggressive military action. That was out of the question. You cannot ever try to do any aggressive military action at least for the foreseeable future. I don't know how long it was supposed to last. We're supposed to build their air force. Things like that. They made them accept complete responsibility for the war. Like it was all their fault, right? So after World War I, Europe is kind of in shambles. There's a lot of destruction, and so it takes a while to recover from that. And then what do you have in 1929? You have the Great Depression, and the Great Depression didn't just affect the United States; it affected the whole world. Okay, so Europe is in this really bad place. They've had a bad war. They've had a lot of death, a lot of destruction. Now they have the Great Depression. So there's poverty, there's unrest, people are upset, and it's just life is not good in Europe. So you have unrest in Europe. You have people unhappy. Now, remember how in our class about the Great Depression, who gets the blame for an economic downturn? Who do people tend to blame? In the United States, they tend to blame the president, right? Whoever's in power at the time, he gets blamed, even though it may not be their fault, because economies go like this. So in Europe, it was the same thing. The leaders got the blame for the economic downturn and for the poverty and for everything. People were angry and upset, and maybe there was a certain amount of incompetency in the leadership. That might have been part of the problem, but but probably not all of the problem, right? It was just a bad deal, and they were blaming their leaders. So what happens when people get upset with leadership? It creates a power vacuum, right? And it gives this opportunity for new leaders to step in, strong leaders to step in and take care of the problem, right? Now, ideally, that's what would happen. A new, good, strong leader would step in, take decisive action, and take care of the problem. And in a sense, that's what happened. The problem was these new, strong leaders were not these really good, just, wise men who had a lot of integrity. They were despots, okay? So despotism is another reason why World War II happened. What is a despot? A despot is somebody who is a tyrant, a dictator, somebody who has complete control of a government. And they're not a good leader, okay? They use their power to do very bad things. All right, so despotism came into Europe, these power vacuums, because people were looking for strong leaders. And strong leaders came along, but they weren't good leaders. So the three main ones that came into the equation were these three guys right here. Okay? In Russia, which later became the USSR, Joe Stalin, however you say his name, came to power. He led a revolution in Russia. Okay, he convinced large majorities of people that socialism and communism was a good idea. Let me back up. He didn't actually lead the revolution. It was led by Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin. I just about said Vladimir Putin, but he's the current president of Russia. Vladimir Lenin led the revolution that threw out the Russian czars and started communism. When Lenin died, Joe Stalin became the dictator, became the leader. And he was far worse than Lenin. He was a despot. He was a wicked man. Okay? So he was in Russia, but again, when the communist revolution took place, it was no longer called Russia. It was called the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So instead of writing all of that out, most people just say the USSR or the Soviet Union. We're going to call them the USSR. Okay? We're the US, they were the USSR, but they were very, very different from us. Okay? And then you have a guy named Benito Mussolini. Sounds like a very innocent name, right? Benito Michicatito. Anyway, never mind. Benito Mussolini, who was the dictator of Italy. And his party, his belief system, what he brought to Italy was something called fascism. Okay? Again, it was very different from communism, but the thing that it had in common is that it gave him complete power. He was a radical dictator, a despot. Okay? And the last and probably most famous, or I should probably say infamous, despot was a guy named Adolf Hitler. Right? You've heard that name. He was in Germany, and he had a party that was called Nazism. Now, fascism and Nazism were very similar. Not much difference between the two of them. So they had a lot in common. Now, communism was very different from the two of these. Fascism and Nazism was more, in a sense you might say, more conservative. They believed in private property and things like that, but it still gave these guys a lot of power. All right? Pretty much complete power. Communism was different. Communism took away private property, and so it was a very different worldview and a very different political system. And that comes into play later on, so that's important. These guys were similar. Communism was very different. All right, so moving on. What happens now in Europe? People begin to see that these things are going on. These guys like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini are coming to power. People don't like it. but they're not sure what to do about it, right? Now remember, in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not supposed to rebuild its military power. It was not supposed to rebuild its air force. It was not supposed to do any kind of aggressive military action, right? Well, what does Hitler do? He starts rebuilding the air force, the military, and he starts doing things that people start saying, wait a second, this is not good. Now, he wasn't supposed to do that. So the other countries that had signed the treaty, they were responsible to keep him from doing that. But they didn't do anything. Why not? People didn't have the stomach for another war, right? They didn't want to go fight Germany again. They just got done with that. And they lost a lot of young people and a lot of, it was just a bad deal, and they didn't want to do it again, right? So they stayed away from it. And they just kind of said, well, we're just gonna keep an eye on them, but we're not going to do anything, right? But in the process, they started forming alliances again. Remember how before World War I, alliances were formed? Well, in World War II, they started to form alliances as well. So there were two major alliances that happened. And they didn't happen all at once, and they didn't all necessarily happen before the war started. But eventually, this is what the alliances became. So you had two major ones. One is called the Axis power. Okay? And the Axis power was made up of Germany. Who else? Anyone know? So of those three despots, who do you think would join Germany? It would make sense for all three of them to be together, right? That's not actually how it turned out. But Germany was joined by Italy. And who was the third country to join these three? Anybody know? Japan. Japan. Where did they come from? Well, Japan is over there on the eastern side of Asia. They're also trying to build an empire. They're just this kind of small island, but they want to grow. They want to be powerful. And they have this religious system where they believe that, they have the right to go kind of conquer the world. And so they want to build an empire too. And so it makes sense for them to join these two countries because Germany wants to be a world power. They want to build a huge empire. They want to bring back, they call it the Third Reich, and all this stuff. And so it made sense for them to join. Now, what would have happened? What would have happened if these guys would have won? Eventually it seems like they would have had to fight each other because I don't think they would have been content sharing power over the world. I think eventually they probably would have fought each other. I don't know. There's actually a TV series that came out, Man in the High Castle. I watched some of the episodes, but then I decided I'm not going to watch it anymore because there's some stuff on it that's not good. But it's a hypothetical scenario where these three countries win World War II and what the world would have been like if that was the case. And it actually brings in some mythical type things, like it's a multiverse type thing going on and everything. An interesting thing about that TV series is that one of the key places because there's this underground resistance where people are trying to throw off the Nazis and the Japanese because they had conquered America in this particular scenario, hypothetical situation. And so there's this resistance of people secretly meeting and trying to build this resistance against the Nazis and the Japanese. And the key meeting place was Canyon City, Colorado, which is part of the reason I started watching it because I thought, wow, this is interesting, right? So again, I stopped because there's some stuff on it that's just not good. Anyway, but yeah, so Germany, Italy, and Japan come together and form an alliance. Again, not right away. Japan jumped in a little bit later. But Germany and Italy jumped in together very soon. Again, it made sense. They were close together. They both believed in very similar political ideologies. Fascism and Nazism were very, very close to each other. Okay, the other alliance was called the Allies. The Allied powers. Now, the Allied powers was actually made up of a bunch of countries, like I think close to 50 different countries. And, you know, they all played a significant part, but a lot of them were smaller countries and didn't have the manpower. But there was the big three. There were the big three countries that made up the Allied powers were these three. Great Britain. Great Britain is always kind of in the middle of it, right? They're over there in Europe. They're fairly strong. They always have to fight against these bad guys. Who else do you think it was? Who else was part of the big three? And this one might surprise you if you haven't studied this time period in history before. The USSR. You thought I was going to write the US, right? The USSR. Okay? Joe Stalin, communism, despot. Aren't these the bad guys? Right? Why are they joining with Great Britain? And yes, the third of the big three is the United States. Okay? So we are joining Great Britain to fight these guys, which makes sense, right? Because us and Great Britain have a lot in common. We believe in a lot of the same things. We don't like despots. So we are getting ready to fight these guys. Why are these guys on our side? Okay? It's very interesting. We'll try to get into that in a little bit. Now, this alliance did not form right away. Okay? In fact, it took the United States a long time to join. So initially it was Great Britain, mainly just Great Britain. Eventually the USSR kind of jumped in and started helping. But Great Britain was fighting alongside of France, but then France fell. Great Britain was kind of alone for a while. But then the USSR started helping, and then the US jumped in. So what led the US to join the war? Because history, you know, we're not going to be able to cover everything about World War II. There's so much you could talk about. We could spend days and days on this lesson, and I don't want to do that. Partly because we're mainly focusing on U.S. history, so we're focusing mainly on the U.S. involvement in World War II, right? So, U.S. involvement. What got the United States of America involved in the war? Because once again, just like in World War I, the U.S. did not want to get involved. They didn't want a war. They just got through the war. You know, you don't want to have to deal with those guys in Europe again, you know, fighting each other all the time. Why do we have to deal with that? Why do we have to fix it? Why can't we just stay over here on our side of the Atlantic Ocean and have a good time? You know, that's their problem, right? Why should we help those guys? They just fought each other like 20 years ago and killed a bunch of themselves, and we had to go bail them out, and now we got to do it again, right? So they didn't want to get involved. Franklin Roosevelt was still the president, and he actually probably would have got involved sooner if he could have, but he did not have the support of the country. The Americans did not want to join the war. And you can't really fight a war if you don't have the support of your people. At least you can't fight it well. You're going to have a lot of problems. And so in Great Britain, there was this guy named Winston Churchill, one of my heroes. Wasn't perfect. He had his issues. But he played a very important part. Okay. So anyway, backing up a little bit. Germany continues to expand their military. They break all the agreements that they had made. You know, they break the treaty. And again, Great Britain and France, they're supposed to do something about it, but they don't. They don't want to. They don't want to mess with it. So they're just kind of like, you know, we'll just let them go. You know, Hitler's over there. He's building their country back up. Maybe that's actually a good thing for the Germans. And so, you know, we hate to mess with that. So they didn't mess with it, right? They kept their hands off. Well, guess what? Germany starts to become aggressive militarily, which means they start invading countries around them. Initially, it was just in a small way. Like they took back some land from like Austria-Hungary or somebody like that, and Czechoslovakia. And everybody's like, whoa, you can't do that. But they just did it, right? And so Neville Chamberlain was Prime Minister of Great Britain. He flies over, has a meeting with a kumbaya meeting with Adolf Hitler, and he's like, okay, listen, buddy, that wasn't good. You shouldn't have done that. But look, we'll let you do it. We'll let you have it. We'll let you keep the land that you conquered if you absolutely promise you won't do any more, right? You won't invade any more. You can have what you got, but you can't do any more. Well, guess what? Well, Hitler agrees to it, right? Signs the papers, shake hands, everybody's happy. Neville Chamberlain flies back to Great Britain, huge crowds greeting him at the airport. He gives a speech, peace in our time, okay? Because he just brokered this great peace deal with Adolf Hitler. There's this one politician in his government named Winston Churchill who's saying, that's not good. That is not good. This is not going to work. Nobody wanted to listen to Winston Churchill. They all wanted Chamberlain. I can't remember his first name. Neville Chamberlain. They liked what he was doing because they wanted peace. They didn't want to hear Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was just saying, this is not going to work. It's like, Adolf Hitler is a monster. Adolf Hitler had no intention of keeping the treaties that he made with Neville Chamberlain, right? And so nobody wanted to listen to Winston Churchill until Adolf Hitler just completely broke the treaties that he made with Chamberlain. He invaded Poland, and then heads south toward France. He took Poland. Just bam. He had this method of warfare called blitzkrieg. They would just move very fast with their ground forces, tanks, jeeps, infantry, and then the Air Force at the same time. They'd all hit at the same time with lightning speed. It was called blitzkrieg, and they just obliterated the Polish people. Now the Polish, they put up a resistance. They fought hard. The Poles were still using horses. They still had a cavalry, and they tried to fight on horseback. They thought they could outmaneuver the tanks with their horses. It absolutely didn't work. Okay, and they were obliterated. Okay, it didn't take long at all. They were not prepared. So then Germany heads south for France. Now France is one of the best militaries in the world, but even they could not stand up against Germany's blitzkrieg, and Germany absolutely obliterates France as well. Now, when Germany invaded Poland, Britain declared war. Britain decided, okay, we got to stop. This he's gone too far. So they declare war. They send troops over to mainland Europe to help France, to try to defend France. They lose. They can't hold France. And 300,000 British troops are trapped in mainland Europe. Okay? And we had this amazing rescue operation. Remember George Washington's rescue on Long Island? This was kind of like that. It was different, but it was kind of like that, where they used every boat they could get a hold of, whether it was a fishing boat, a pleasure boat, people with their yachts or whatever that they used for pleasure sailing on the English Channel. Every boat that they could get a hold of sailed across the English Channel, picked up British soldiers, and brought them back to back to Great Britain and rescued them. They rescued over 300,000 British soldiers. If that rescue operation wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have worked, the war might have been over before it started. And Hitler would have taken Great Britain, probably, and that would have left the United States to fight them almost alone. We would have maybe had the USSR on our side. But anyway, so when all this goes down, and then the Nazis start heading for Great Britain. They're like, okay, time to go. We got France, time to go for Great Britain. So, you have the English Channel between mainland Europe and Great Britain. So they, instead of crossing the English Channel and attacking on land, they started attacking them through the air with their air force called the Luftwaffe. And they started bombing them through the air. Now, one of the key things that happened in World War II is that the British Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, fought the Luftwaffe as hard as they could. They were outmanned. The Luftwaffe had better airplanes, but the British Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, fought tooth and nail, and they resisted the Germans and kept them from being as effective as they could have been. So Hitler, his goal was to weaken the British and then to invade them on land, but it wasn't working. Okay, he kept trying to weaken them through bombing, and it just wasn't working. The British morale stayed very high, and part of the reason it stayed high is because when Neville Chamberlain realized he had made a terrible mistake, he resigned. Winston Churchill became the prime minister, and he started speaking to his people over the radio. Now remember, radios have just recently been invented. He starts speaking to his people over the radio, and he gives these powerful, inspiring speeches. Like, he didn't guarantee victory. He just said, listen, we can't stop fighting. We have to do this. He said, I have nothing to offer you except blood, sweat, toil, and tears. And then he would say things like, we will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them in the meadows. We will fight them in the pastures. We will never surrender. I don't think I said that quite right, but anyway, something to that degree. And this inspired the British people so much that Hitler could not break their will. So he quit. He decided rather than continuing to aim for Great Britain, he's going to head toward the Soviet Union. Now, something had happened between the beginning of the war and now that Hitler no longer likes Stalin. Initially, him and Stalin had kind of made some agreements, some non-aggression agreements, some peace treaties that they weren't going to fight each other. But now they decided they don't like each other anymore. And part of the reason, again, was because of the difference between Nazism and communism. There was a huge difference between those two ideologies. And so Hitler did not trust Stalin, and Stalin did not trust Hitler. So we can be very thankful that those two guys did not agree, because if Russia, the USSR, would have joined the Axis power, it would have been a very, very much more difficult to win that war. So anyway, Hitler decides to head for the USSR. And initially, he has a lot of success. He marches right up into the USSR, blitzkrieg warfare, wipes out the Russians for the first, several hundred miles or however long it was, until he gets to the city of Stalingrad. I believe Stalingrad is the capital of the USSR, and it's the city that Stalin has his name attached to, and he's not ready to give this up without a fight. So the Russians fight tooth and nail to protect Stalingrad. And then something else happens. Winter sets in, okay? Winter in the USSR is brutal, and the Germans were not prepared for winter fighting. Their equipment would break down, and it wouldn't work right. They didn't know how to fight in the wintertime. It was so cold that soldiers were just freezing to death right and left. So eventually, it wasn't working anymore, and so they started moving back, and the Russians chased them all the way back to Germany. And that was kind of the turning point, where Hitler no longer was able to be as successful as what he had initially been. Okay, so I give you all that, all right? Now we got to get back to the United States. Why did the United States get involved? Does anybody know? So again, what was the third country? You have Germany, Italy, and what's the third country? Japan. So Japan is sitting way over there in East Asia, wanting to build their power, okay? And they start going around and defeating all these small Pacific islands, okay? And taking them and adding them to their empire. Now they know that eventually they're going to get too close to the United States. They start defeating these islands, and they start getting worried that as they're conquering these islands, that they're going to make America angry, and America is going to come after them. So they decide to make the first strike. Rather than waiting for the Americans to get involved, they're going to hit the Americans first. So that's what they did. And where did they hit them? Who knows? Pearl Harbor, okay? So Pearl Harbor is the strategic naval base in Hawaii, right? And there's a bunch of battleships there. There's a bunch of Navy people stationed there, airplanes and things like that. Well, guess what? Japan does a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and it's so successful that the Americans don't know they're coming until they're 300 miles away. And 300 miles is not very far in an airplane. Okay? That the Americans saw them coming on their radar. They saw the blips on the radar, and they mistook them for their own planes. They thought it was their own guys coming in. They were like, oh, there's some guys on the radar. They must be our guys, because they were absolutely not expecting the Japanese to attack. So the Japanese come flying in. All of a sudden, people look up, and here's these airplanes, these enemy airplanes coming and bombing them. They are not expecting it whatsoever. Okay? It's massively successful for the Japanese. They sink a whole bunch of battleships, a whole bunch of troops are killed. Airplanes are, American airplanes are bombed before they even get off the ground, right? Massively successful. Or was it? What does Pearl Harbor do? Pearl Harbor is a very important point in the war. Okay, what does it do? Well, first of all, it destroyed a large portion of the U.S. Navy. Okay, it destroys a large portion of the U.S. Navy. I think it was like 20 ships that they sank. And overnight, the U.S. Navy is bam, almost obliterated. Now, thankfully, all of the aircraft carriers were out at sea at that point and were not there when the attack happened. That was crucial. That was absolutely crucial. Okay, so from a Japanese perspective, initially this looks like a massive success. But what happens as a result of this? America has to join the war, right? They can't sit around anymore. They can't sit back and say, oh, let those guys deal with it. No, they've been attacked. So now they have to join. So Japan awakes the sleeping giant, right? So it caused the U.S. to join the war. So I think you could make the argument that this is a tactical error on the part of the Axis powers. The first tactical error was when Hitler decided to head for the USSR instead of continuing to go for Great Britain. I mean, that's my opinion, but I think that was a tactical mistake. And then I think the second was when Japan decided to attack the United States. I think they wanted too much too soon. If they would have taken their time and built their power and built their, and slowly but steadily, conquered countries, maybe they could have been successful. But that's probably one of the mistakes that a lot of dictatorial, tyrannical, power-hungry despots make. They want power and they want it now, right? They don't want to wait. Okay, so they can't hold back. They just keep going. And they go too far, too fast, too soon. And then this happens. So the United States gets involved. Now, even though the United States joined because of Japan, they didn't just set their targets on Japan. It would have made sense for them, well, it seems like it would have made sense for them to just say, Japan is the one who attacked us, so they're the ones we're going after. But that's not what they did. They joined the Allied powers. They got together with Great Britain and the USSR, and they decided that the best strategy was for all three of them to work together to bring down Adolf Hitler first, to defeat the Germans first, and then deal with the others. So again, in the meantime, Hitler had headed for the USSR, or at some point he headed for the USSR, and that turned bad for him. Eventually, the Nazis were pushed back to Germany. Also, while that was going on, and I said that I don't think that actually happened before before Pearl Harbor. I think that was more after Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. was already involved. Anyway, so let's talk about the battle against Italy and Germany. So in this process of trying to build their regimes, their empires, Italy and Germany together had pushed down into South or into North Africa. So they had taken most of Europe and started pushing down into northern Africa. So the U.S. and Britain decided, rather than going full-fledged, frontal onto, hitting them on the Western Front through France, they decided to start by going down into Africa and working their way up. I think it was Winston Churchill that called it Hitler's soft underbelly. They saw that they were weaker in the South. So the U.S. and Great Britain pushed up from Africa. They pushed up toward Italy from Africa. Because remember, Italy is that boot that goes down into the Mediterranean Sea, so they're right above Africa. Eventually, they took Italy. Now, before this actually happened, the Italian people had already become very disparaged and angry with Benito Mussolini, and they didn't like him anymore, so they kicked him out and took back the government, and then surrendered to the Allied powers. Mussolini eventually was actually captured by his people and executed by his own people. Okay, so Italy fell, but now they have to deal with Germany, right? Germany is still a formidable foe. So one of the things that they did to weaken Germany was they firebombed them. Okay? Firebomb Germany. Now, this is brutal. What do you do to weaken a country? If you have an air force, you send airplanes in and you bomb strategic locations. You bomb the pipelines, the manufacturing industry, you bomb military bases. You try to weaken their infrastructure and make it harder for them to keep fighting. Well, they tried that, and it was, I think, maybe somewhat successful. But the problem is the German people were so resilient. They were, Hitler had inspired them to become something. And so their morale, kind of like the British people, their morale stayed high. They just kept wanting to fight. And so the Allies changed their tactics. They decided to do something that would break the morale of the German people. So instead of bombing strategic places like military bases and oil pipelines and railroad tracks, they decided to bomb cities, just plain old cities that had almost nothing to do with the war. Cities that had a lot of beautiful architecture and art and culture and really were not contributing much to the war. So they went in with these bombs. They were called fire bombs, and I don't know how they worked, but somehow when they blew up, they didn't just explode, but they somehow created this massive windstorm that would take fire and just spread it. So it was like they would go in and they'd firebomb these cities, and it was just massive destruction. Thousands of people died, and they were innocent people for the most part, and it's very controversial. But it did affect the morale of the German people when suddenly these cities that had nothing to do, or very little to do with the war, were getting bombed by these horrible firebombs that were just killing so many people and causing so much destruction. So they did that, and eventually they decided to attack the Western Front. So we had this huge, massive battle, and if you've studied World War II at all, you've probably heard about it. It's called D-Day, Normandy, different things. There's movies about it. Saving Private Ryan is the classic movie. Again, not sure I recommend it because it's brutally violent. But anyway, so they send thousands of troops across the English Channel to France, and imagine that. You're like in a boat, okay, and it's kind of like a dump truck going backwards toward the beach, and then suddenly the back of it opens up, and you as a soldier have to just get off the boat and start wading through the water, right? So you have water up to your waist, you have your gun, all your equipment, and you're trying to wade to the beach, right? And the Germans have this huge resistance. I mean, it's extremely heavily fortified, and they're just raining machine gun fire onto you as you're walking toward the beach. And have you ever tried to walk or run through water that's up to your waist? You can't run, right? You can't move fast, and you're exposed. There's nothing to hide behind. And so that's what they did. They invaded the beach at Normandy on D-Day to take back France, and it was a brutal, bloody, horrible affair, but it was actually successful. The Allied troops were able to take the beach and start taking back France. Okay, so you have, well, let's write that down. We took France. And advanced from the west. Okay, so yeah, now you have soldiers from the south side from Africa coming up, from the west side from France coming over, and you have the Soviet Union, the USSR soldiers from the east pushing from the east. And slowly but steadily, the Nazi regime gets crushed in against itself. They made one big attempt to counterattack in the middle of all of this. It's called the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler found a weak part in the Allied lines, and he went for it with all his worth. It was almost successful, but not quite. They weren't able to break through, and that was the last hurrah. That was the last attempt of Hitler to try to actually continue fighting in any kind of a meaningful way. So eventually the whole thing crumbled, and Hitler, when he saw he was done, he committed suicide, and Germany's done, Italy's done. So let's put down the USSR advanced from the east. And the Nazi regime crumbles. So yay! We got Hitler, we got the Germans, everything's great, it's all over, right? No, it's not over. What do we still got to do? Italy's gone, Germany's gone. Guess who is still fighting? Japan, right? We still got to deal with Japan. Now the thing about Japan is they were fierce fighters. Okay, and they have all these islands throughout the Pacific Ocean. So the U.S. the Allies began taking back Pacific islands. So they start going from one island to the next, taking them back. Now here's the thing, like there's all these islands spread out through the Pacific Ocean that Japan has taken. So they come up with a strategy. Instead of taking them back one by one and slowly working their way back to Japan, they're going to jump over some of them and get closer to Japan and start taking them back. And then that leaves the ones behind them kind of isolated by themselves, right? And it was a good strategy. But the problem was that Japan, they weren't just power hungry. They were religious, okay? And they believed that it was more honorable to die in battle than to surrender. So they were kind of like the Muslims, right? The Muslims believe that if they die in battle, they go straight to heaven and get their 70 virgins or whatever. And I don't know exactly how the Japanese believed, but it was they had this honor system, and it was a religion. It was more than just the desire to rule the world. It was they believed that there was a spiritual purpose behind what they were doing. Okay, so they would rather die than surrender. So imagine that the Allied forces would land on an island, that the Japanese controlled and start fighting them. And the fighting was bitter and brutal because the Japanese wouldn't surrender. So you basically have to kill them all to get the island, right? Now they didn't necessarily have to kill all of them, but almost. Sometimes they had to kill like up to about 90% of them before they would finally surrender. So that's what they were facing, and it was every time they took back these islands. One was called Iwo Jima, another one was called Okinawa. And every time they took back these islands, it was brutal for the Japanese, obviously, because they had to kill so many of them, but it was also brutal for the Allies. The Allies lost a lot of troops. It was bloody, costly fighting. So yeah, bloody and costly. During this time, there was an air battle, an aerial battle that took place called Midway, and we talked about that. It was a movie that just came out. That was also a crucial turning point where the United States intercepted some kind of intelligence report, and they figured out where the Japanese were going to be, and they surprise attacked them in the air, and they shot down a whole bunch of their airplanes and sank a whole bunch of their aircraft carriers. And so that was a huge turning point as well. So let's put down Midway. That was part of the battle for the Pacific, right? So anyway, but back to this. The Americans were like, if it's so hard for us to take these islands back, if it's so costly, if we lose so many men trying to take back Iwo Jima and Okinawa, what's it going to be like to take back the island of Japan itself? Because this is their country. This is their nation. And this is where their strongest stronghold is, right? So if we lost so many men trying to take back these islands, what's it going to be like when we invade Japan? We're going to lose thousands of men. It's going to cost billions of dollars, and it's going to take years. And that led to one of the most significant decisions probably ever to be made in a war. Okay, but let's back up just a little bit before we get to that. Let's talk about mainland Japan. So once again, they used a very similar strategy as they had with Germany. They firebombed them. So they firebombed Tokyo. Okay, again, death, destruction, horrible. But it would not break the will of the Japanese people because, again, the Japanese believe it's more honorable to die than to surrender. The Japanese aren't even close to surrender. They don't care. Okay? So the firebombs don't work. All right, now I need to back up. Okay, so earlier in the war, very close to the beginning of the war, President Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, gets a letter from a very smart guy by the name of Albert Einstein. You've heard that name, right? Albert Einstein is a German scientist. But Albert Einstein saw what was happening with Adolf Hitler. Now, Albert Einstein had some colleagues, I don't think it was him, but some other friends, other scientists, who were developing this massive weapon called an atomic bomb. Okay? And they were developing it for Germany. But at some point, these scientists and Einstein figured out that if Hitler gets a hold of this bomb, that is not going to be good. Even though they were Germans, right? They started to see what Hitler was like, and they didn't like it. So they sent word to the Americans saying, look, we're very close to getting this bomb, and we know it's not going to be good. So they actually sent the information that they had. I think I have this right. You can research it if you want to. They sent the information they had to the Americans and said, we don't want to make this bomb for Hitler. You guys make it. You need it. Something to that effect. I hope I have the story right. It was a very significant thing because if Hitler would have got a hold of the atomic bomb, look out, right? That would have been a very bad deal. So anyway, the Americans got the information and they continued to develop it. And they went ahead and they produced these atomic bombs and they tested one in the deserts of like New Mexico or something. And the people that watched it were like, wow, that's really powerful. Okay? So, there's this decision to make, right? We can spend billions of dollars, lose thousands of troops. It's going to take years. Thousands of innocent people are going to die. Thousands of Japanese civilians are going to die. If we invade on land, it's just going to be costly. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be ugly. Or we can take a gamble and we can drop the atomic bomb and see if that works. So by now, Franklin Roosevelt had actually died. He was actually in poor health for most of his presidency. He passed away before the end of World War II. And his vice president, Harry Truman, became the president. And he said, let's do it. So they sent a warning to the Japanese. They didn't tell them. There were actually some people that said, we should just show them a video, and describe to them what we can do. And maybe they'll surrender. And Truman said, no, we're just going to send them a warning. He said, either you surrender or it's going to be mass destruction. Well, of course the Japanese aren't going to surrender, right? Of course not. So they refused to surrender. And so Truman gives the order. And this massive, massive bomb gets dropped on Japan. Now, it gets dropped on 2 different cities. And I am not exactly sure which one was first. They dropped one on Nagasaki and one on Hiroshima. And again, I don't know which one was first. They dropped the first one, and it absolutely obliterated the city. I mean, just bam. Killed thousands and thousands of people. And the Japanese were like, whoa. But did they surrender? Nope. So what does the U.S. do? They send another one. And they hit the other city, whichever one it was. Bam. Well, the Japanese finally realized that, look, we can't even fight, right? How are you going to fight against a bomb that gets dropped out of the sky? I don't know if they didn't have airplanes. I'm not sure if they couldn't fight. But anyway, they couldn't even put up a resistance. And the U.S. is going through just obliterating one city after the other. And basically Japan is like, we can't, we can't do anything. So they decided to surrender, which was actually a good thing because the U.S. only had 2 bombs. And it would have taken years to develop more. But the Japanese didn't know that. As far as they knew, they had 50 of them, right? So they surrendered. On August 14 of 1945, Japan agrees to surrender. August 5th, 14 of 1945, Japan agrees to surrender. Finally, World War II comes to an end. So what was the impact of World War II? What kind of effects did it have? Well, approximately 55 million people died. And this is not just soldiers, this includes civilians, and I think it includes, and we didn't even talk about the Holocaust. We talk about that a lot more in world history. Hitler trying to destroy the Jews. And not just Jews, but handicapped people and other people he didn't like. He slaughtered about 10 million. So I think it counts that. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's a lot of people. A lot of people died in World War II. There was mass destruction. I mean, here's the thing. Modern warfare is becoming more and more modern. New technology is a wonderful thing, but when you start using it for war, it gets brutal. So now we have these fire bombs, we have airplanes, we have machine guns, we have tanks, we have landmines, and then the atomic bomb, right? And it's brutal. So there's massive property destruction. Europe and Japan are in shambles. Okay, Europe, especially Germany, but a lot of Europe has just had tremendous destruction. Tremendous destruction. And Japan, of course, they got firebombed and then they got 2 atomic bombs. So Japan is in shambles. Now here's the interesting thing. Japan and Germany, for that matter, have become some of the most productive countries in recent history. Where do electronics come from? Where do all of our smartphones come from? Maybe not all of them, but a lot of this technology comes from where? It comes from Japan. You know why? Because instead of socking it to them like they did in World War I, the Allies and the Americans actually helped Japan and I think Germany get back on their feet after the war. They helped them. Okay? That's a much better way of doing it than just like slamming them with all these, extremely harsh stipulations that make them angry and bitter and end up causing another war, right? Because again, most of the people in Japan and Germany, for that matter, probably didn't necessarily want what Hitler wanted or what Emperor Hirohito wanted. I mean, maybe to a certain degree. Most people just want to live their lives, right? They just want to, raise their families and have peace. Now, Hitler was able to convince a lot of people to do the things that he got them to do. So he had a lot of people supporting him. But there were a lot of people in Germany who didn't realize the extent of what Hitler was doing. Okay? And so you can't punish everybody because of Hitler, right? So the Americans helped Japan, and I think they helped Germany. I'm not sure if I have that correct, but those countries have become very productive since then. Now Japan is struggling economically now, but that's because of other things. Anyway, completely different subject. All right, but anyway, what about the U.S.? This is a significant time in history because the U.S. emerged as the new world power. Okay? So we talked about how after World War I, the United States is positioning itself to become the next world power. They're on the other side of the ocean, so they're not getting bombed. I mean, Pearl Harbor got hit, but that's basically it, right? So they came out of this actually. Remember, World War II ended the Great Depression. Okay, the economic machine got back to work. People were producing things, they were working, they were making things. So World War II got them out of the Great Depression. And since they lost a lot of soldiers in the war, they lost a lot of young men, which is terribly tragic. But overall, the country got going again. And now, Britain took a hit, France took a hit. All these other world powers were taking these hits and getting weaker. But the U.S. emerges as the most powerful country in the world. And that's what we are to this day. How long we will be, I have no idea. But anyway, that's when the U.S. became the world power. All right, I know this is a long video, guys. I'll give you a couple days to get it done. Read chapter 28 in Changing Frontiers, your textbook. Make sure you leave your feedback, class participation. Awesome, that's all I got.